to behead him. One of them, it seems, had a knife. So the objection here is that it's extremely insulting to put any kind of political protest, but I think particularly this, given that many of the people who are commemorated at the Cenotaph are those who died fighting fascism.
Absolutely.
To be essentially occupied in what I think was an extremely symbolic way by a protest with many in the crowd who would have been celebrating the massacre of Jews.
And don't forget, there's only 3 words on the Cenotaph. It's the glorious dead. And I think every time I walk past the Cenotaph, I used to walk past it every day on my way to work, and I look at Lutyen's magnificent structure, I actually used to bow my head and just think, thank God, thank the country that people were prepared to give their lives for freedom and then sacrifice the war against fascism. How different it is today.
Yeah, and one of the people who was one of the organisers of that particular demonstration at the weekend was interviewed in the media, and he said, we will do this every weekend until the war ends. And we could be looking at a year of every single weekend of the centre of London brought to a standstill by people waving Palestinian
we draw a line now. We draw the line here and now.
We've got a crisis
of
identity here in the West. Are we sure of who we are?
No, I think
culturally, very difficult.
It's very clear that in London there is no cohesive sense of identity anymore.
Well, Rishi Sunak, as we say, will be taking to the floor imminently for Prime Minister's questions this morning. Everybody's coming back from the break, from their conferences as well. There will be a lot of emotion in the room, as anybody who's had this discussion, even with friends and family, about the issue in the Middle East, no doubt tensions in this room will also be running high. People have very entrenched positions. Let's go live to the House of Commons. Here we go.
This is Chris Law, who I was telling you is about to ask the first question.
The House would have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ahli Hospital. As my honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has said, we are working independently and with our allies to find out what has happened. I'm sure that honourable members will be raising further questions with me during today's session. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I associate myself and the whole of my party here with the horrors and unfolding tragedy of the bombing last night in Gaza of the hospital. Mr. Speaker, the Rafah border crossing from besieged Gaza into Egypt has been hit by several Israeli airstrikes, causing absolute terror for those who urgently need this crossing open to escape. Nadia El Nakla, an elected councillor in my city of Dundee and the wife of Scotland's First Minister, has had to take calls from her parents, Elizabeth and Majid, who, like all others trapped in Gaza, have been describing the horrors of death and indiscriminate killings everywhere. Members of her family were hit yesterday by a rocket from a drone, and Nadia's mother was saying her final goodbyes this morning, adding, "Last night was the end for me. Better if my heart stops, and then I'll be at peace. I can't take another night." Mr. Speaker, with military action intensifying and the death toll rapidly rising, the Prime Minister's first responsibility must be to bring British citizens home. So can the Prime Minister please give his personal assurances that every single step has been taken to open the Rafah crossing for both humanitarian aid and for UK nationals like Nadia's family to flee?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the thoughts of everyone in this House will be with those families affected by what is happening in Israel and in Gaza. And I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance that we are doing everything in our power to ensure the safety of British nationals that are caught up in all of this, including my calls with leaders across the region, particularly around opening the Rafah border crossing, which is why I prioritised talking to President Sisi last week, and we continue to have dialogue both with the Israelis and the Egyptians about the Rafah crossing.
Sir Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to live in the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. But it saddens me, and I think it shames this whole House, that British Jews have been subject to such vile abuse and hatred in recent days. Anti-Semitism and all hate crimes, they fly in the face of British values. And we should not allow events abroad, no matter how horrific they are, to be used to sow seeds of division in our own country. So whilst I welcome all the actions that my right honourable friend is taking to fight hate crime, to bring people together, may I ask him to consider urgently an immediate and specific policy of revoking the visas of any foreign national that commits an act of anti-Semitism or any other hate crime.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, who himself has done so much over the years to fight anti-Semitism. The increase in incidents we've seen over the past week is utterly sickening, and this government will do whatever it takes to keep our Jewish community safe. That's why we've provided an additional £3 million of funding to support the Community Security Trust, and we are working with the police to ensure that hate crime and the glorification of terror is met with the full force of the law. Under our existing immigration rules, we do have the power to cancel a person's presence in the UK if it is not conducive to the public good. Mr. Speaker, we will not tolerate this hatred, not in our country, not in this century.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West? Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al-Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House. This morning, I met with the National Security Advisor, but also the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I can tell the honourable gentleman our intelligence services have been rapidly analysing the evidence to independently establish the facts. We are not in a position at this point to say more than that, but I can tell him we are working at pace, but also cooperating and collaborating with our allies on this issue as we look to get to the bottom of the situation, and we will also continue all our efforts to get humanitarian aid into the region.
Keir Starmer.
I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The terrible news last night came as we are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst. They know the lives of their loved ones are in the hands of murderers. It's unimaginable agony. Israel has a right, a duty, to defend itself from Hamas, keep its people safe, and bring hostages home. But isn't it clear that if Hamas had a single concern for human life, a single concern for the safety of the Palestinian people, then they would never have taken these hostages, and they should release them immediately.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important consistently for us to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack, and it is Hamas and Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict. Our thoughts are rightly with those who have been taken hostage and their families. The distress they are feeling will be unimaginable for all those affected. I will be meeting with some of the families and offering them all the support of the British government to get their relatives home. We are working around the clock with our partners and allies to secure their freedom. And importantly, in amongst my other regional calls, I spoke specifically with the Emir of Qatar yesterday on this very issue, which we discussed at length. The Qatari government is taking a lead and working intensely to help release hostages using their contacts in the region, and we are working very closely with them to ensure the safe return of the British hostages.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I also met charities with staff working in Gaza and heard their accounts of the harrowing humanitarian crisis. Children fleeing their homes, hospitals barely able to function. The lights are going out, and the innocent civilians of Gaza are terrified that they will die in the darkness, out of sight. International law must always be followed. Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Does he agree that medicines, food, fuel and water must get into Gaza immediately? This is an urgent situation, and innocent Palestinians need to know that the world is not just simply watching, but acting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, an acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. It is right that we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we have provided a further £10 million in humanitarian aid for people in the region. And we are working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams to Egypt, specifically to the El Arish airfield. We are working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the United Nations primarily, and deploying Navy assets to the region, as well as exploring how we can support logistical requirements. And I've also raised this issue of humanitarian access in all of my conversations as a priority with every leader in the region, and we will continue working with them to get aid to where it is needed as quickly as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been alluded to, since Hamas's terrorist attack, our country has seen a disgusting rise in anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, and Jewish families hiding who they are. And we've seen an appalling surge in Islamophobia, racist graffiti, mosques forced to ramp up security, British Muslims and Palestinians spoken to as if they were terrorists. Does he agree with me that every member of this House has a duty to work in their constituency and across the country to say no to this hate, and to ensure every British Jew and every British Muslim knows that they can live their life free from fear and free from discrimination here in their own country?
Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can play our part in stamping out those who seek to cause division and hate in our society. We will make sure that we continue funding, as I said, the Community Security Trust, but also the equivalent protective security grant to protect mosques and other places of worship for the Islamic community in the UK. That funding was increased earlier this year. We will also remain in dialogue with the police to make sure that they are aware of the full tools at their disposal to arrest those who perpetrate hate crimes, incite racial or other religious violence. There is no place for that in our society, and I know this House will stand united in making sure that those who do this face the full force of the law.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not want this conflict to harm us here at home, and we do not want it to escalate in the Middle East, where there has been too much bloodshed, too much darkness for too long. A two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel, feels more distant than ever, but it remains the only way through. Does the Prime Minister agree that because hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest to ensure the voices of division and despair are sidelined, and that, however difficult it seems, the hope of a political path to peace is maintained?
Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because it is that vision of a more hopeful, peaceful future that Hamas tried to destroy that we must redouble our efforts to try and bring that future about. And all our conversations that both myself and the Foreign Secretary have had with regional leaders, we've emphasised our commitment to making sure that we make progress on all the avenues that will lead towards that peaceful future, and that has been a feature of both mine and the Foreign Secretary's dialogue, and I'm confident that there is willingness in the region not to escalate this crisis beyond dealing with Hamas, the terrorist organisation, but also to strive very hard to a future where Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully side by side and look forward to a future filled with dignity, security and prosperity.
Keir Starmer.
This is a crisis where lives hang in the balance, and where the enemies of peace and democracy would like nothing more than for us to become divided and to abandon our values. Does the Prime Minister agree that during this grave crisis, this House must strive to speak with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, and for the dignity of all human life that cannot be protected without humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza and the constant maintenance of the rule of international law?
Mr. Speaker, I agree. We will in this House speak with one voice in condemning Hamas for perpetrating a shockingly brutal terrorist attack and causing untold suffering on many. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, we stand united in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli president has made it very clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, whilst remembering, importantly in this House, that it is Hamas that is cruelly embedding itself in civilian populations.
Andy Carter.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the words of the Prime Minister, and can I commend the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the work they're doing to find a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to provide £12 billion worth of funding for east-west high-speed rail lines between Manchester and Liverpool, and his focus on great northern towns as well as cities in the north. Will the Prime Minister ensure that towns like Warrington benefit fully from this rail upgrade, and that a hub station at Warrington Bank Quay, linking Northern Powerhouse Rail to the West Coast Main Line, remains a key part of the Network North?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaign to improve rail services in Warrington, and he's right. We will be investing £12 billion to better connect Manchester and Liverpool. This would allow for the delivery of Northern Powerhouse Rail exactly as previously planned, including high-speed lines, which would provide better rail connections for the people living in northern towns like Warrington. And I know that he'll be discussing this further when he meets with the Rail Minister.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all continue to unequivocally condemn the abhorrent terrorist attack on the Jewish people and the Israeli state. We fully support the defeat of Hamas and, of course, the safe return of all hostages who have been taken. So too, I hope, do we all share the same common humanity of protecting civilians and condemning any acts of collective punishment against the Palestinian people. In that regard, many of the images emanating from Gaza in recent days will shock us all to the core. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he join with us on these benches and call for an immediate ceasefire in the region?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism and ensure that the awful attack that we've seen from Hamas cannot happen again. And unlike Hamas, the Israelis, including the President, have made it clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, my ask for a ceasefire is done with all sincerity to protect civilians, but also to ensure that we have the safe creation of humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors which will allow for food, for water and for vital medicines to get into Gaza, but also for innocent civilians caught up in this terrible conflict to flee. In respect of those who wish to flee, can I ask the Prime Minister what early consideration, if any, his government has given to the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme akin to that previously put in place for Syrian nationals, Afghani nationals and, of course, Ukrainian nationals?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are already one of the most significant contributors to the United Nations efforts to support Palestinian refugees, and our funding supports around 5.8 million refugees annually. And On Monday, we announced a significant increase in our funding of aid to the region, including to the UN to support refugees. With regard to humanitarian aid, as I said before, we are already working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams into the region, but critically the most important thing is to open up access for that aid to get into Gaza, which is why our conversations with the Egyptians and others are so critical. We continue to work closely with allies to find every way to get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So we've got Prime Minister's questions dominated by this issue of Israel and Gaza. Stephen Flynn there pressing the Prime Minister on the issue of a ceasefire. But Rishi Sunak with this repeated line that Israel had the right to act in its own defence and this agreement that he said Israel had made that its forces would act within international law. Earlier, in response to some other questions, the Prime Minister indicating that he'd spoken to the Emir of Qatar, using contacts in the region as regards the families of those members or those Britons still being held in Gaza, but no direct comment on these reports that he may be travelling to the region as early as tomorrow. We're joined in the studio by a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Henry Smith, Tory MP. Henry, clearly they're not going to comment for security reasons on what he's going to be doing, but there is the question, what benefit could that bring?
Well, I do think it's important that senior members of the international community do show support for Israel during this very difficult period. We've had the Foreign Secretary obviously visiting Israel last week, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and President Biden there today. The UK has a significant role to play internationally, historically and in the future, and I do think it is important that the UK Prime Minister is there to be able to show that support, but also to look towards solutions by working with our interlocutors in the Middle East.
And something perhaps more specific in terms of those communications with Qatar, and that is the 10 or so people, the Britons, that we believe are still being held in Gaza.
Well, the Qataris, I understand, are looking to perhaps broker an agreement whereby hostages might be released. And obviously, anything that can be done to release those hostages is, I think, very important. But beyond that, I think engaging with others in the region, the King of Jordan was in London just a few days ago, engaging with the Jordanians as well is very important, as it is with the Egyptians too, to find hopefully a solution going forward where peace can be restored and that those innocent people who are affected on all sides of this conflict can get the relief and support that they need.
What pressure do you think Rishi Sunak will bring to bear on this growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, getting those supplies in?
Well, I think Britain is very well respected in the region, and I think that's why we have a particularly important role to play to ensure that not only are we promoting a peaceful solution to the tragedy that has occurred over the last 10 days or so in Israel and Gaza, but also to make sure that those innocent civilians who have been so desperately affected do actually get the support that they need. And I think Britain, again, is showing that it walks tall on the international stage.
I think I'm right in saying you were on the International Development Committee as well before.
In the previous Parliament, I was on the International Development.
So there is this question, and that is that international aid has been provided in substantial quantities to Gaza and to the Hamas administration that's been running it for these recent years. It has failed to achieve, if you like that phrase, soft diplomacy. So despite, obviously, the human need of water and medicines and so on, does there have to be a reassessment about whether international aid works in terms of politics?
Yes, I think there does need to be. I think there's a distinction to be made in terms of emergency assistance to people who perhaps have been the victims of an earthquake or a conflict situation like this, and then long-term international assistance to countries and to administrations of various parts of the world. And I think it's deeply, deeply disturbing of reports that European Union aid towards Gaza, water pipes, for example, were actually converted into missile launching tubes. So I do think there needs to be a very serious reassessment of how our international assistance is provided and the reasons that it is provided for.
Something Stephen Flynn raised was calls for a refugee resettlement scheme, which some people would say is not unreasonable, given what we've done for Afghanis, for Ukrainians. Something that Humza Yousaf raised yesterday, didn't he, saying he would welcome refugees to Scotland.
Well, the Scottish government often say that they welcome refugees, but when it actually comes to the distribution of refugees around the United Kingdom, they are some of the worst in terms of stepping up and providing assistance. It's often South East England that actually, and London, that takes the vast majority.
Could a refugee resettlement scheme be a possibility?
I don't think that is a realistic possibility. Every time there is a conflict situation in the world, we can't sort of transplant large numbers of that population and just move them to the United Kingdom. But we welcomed
Ukrainians and we
welcomed I think we do need to assess the situation. The Syrian civil war over the last decade, half the population of Syria have left that country and many are now in Europe. That is an unsustainable situation. There will be crises, sadly, around the world that go on, and we do have we have this debate about limited housing, limited public services, and we cannot just keep on transplanting population.
Henry, we're just going to break away from PMQs because we're getting pictures in of armour on the move. I think that is a tank that we can see there. We believe this is south of Israel, close to the border, of course. Various assessments of whether there will be a full-scale ground offensive or whether there will be a more staged operation, if you like. But clearly the other aspect is what they spoke about in PMQs, and that is the situation with the hospital there, and trying to find out in this fog of war exactly what's gone on and what the next step should be.
Well, I think you said it. It is the fog of war. And, of course, the trouble is an incident happens. You report it here on GBNews, other outlets as well. And immediately, all of us armchair experts sitting at home take to Twitter, or X as it is now, and opine as to what's happened. And I think that actually isn't very helpful. We don't know whether it was an IDF rocket that hit the hospital. We don't know if it was a Hamas rocket misfiring. Or we don't know, and I think this is a possibility, whether it was deliberate action by Hamas. We know that they use human beings as shields. They care little for human life.
Or a so-called false flag attack.
Or a false flag attack. We simply don't know. We don't have that intelligence.
Rishi Sunak did say in PMQs the UK intelligence services are rapidly analysing the evidence to find out what happened. One assumes that we do have capability, looking at certainly the television pictures that have been put out there and what the IDF are looking at, that we can work back to try and find out forensically what happened.
I think it's important to try and find out exactly what happens, particularly when there is a major incident where a hospital is hit by a rocket. We do need to try and get to the truth of that. But, as you correctly said, in the fog of war, that is extremely difficult to do. And what we need to guard against is taking actions or making statements before we have the full facts.
But the bottom line is that strike, and we know there's different versions of this, but whoever is behind it or whatever caused it is going to ramp up tension even more, and it's already awful.
And that is exactly what the terrorists want. They want division. And I think one of the things we haven't spoken about is Iran in this situation. The Iranian regime has been increasingly alarmed at growing accords, the Abraham Accords, the agreements
with Saudi Arabia, particularly
between the Gulf states and the growing agreements with Saudi Arabia. That is an existential threat to their wanting a destabilised Middle East and a destabilised world.
Do they want to get drawn into this, Iran?
I think Iran are the instigators of this. I think they're the ones who have been supporting Hamas. They're the ones, I think, who are probably the inspiration and providing a lot of the equipment to launch such an attack, and other groups to the north of Israel, such as Hezbollah as well.
But Washington has been very cautious about making any direct correlation or direct link.
Well, and so is the British government as well. And yesterday I was questioning the Minister the Middle East Minister in the Foreign Affairs Committee about why, for example, we're not proscribing the IRGC, which is the sort of the extreme wing of the Iranian government that is
the political wing rather than
the political ring that is causing tensions here on the streets of London, as we saw last weekend. We really need to get real with our response to Iran, whether that's Washington or London. They are as big a threat to Western democracy as Russia or China are.
But why do you think Hezbollah have not moved? Because very early on, you know, the indications were, oh, there'll be a war on two fronts, and that there's some kind of correlation between Hamas and Hezbollah, and Iran's pulling the strings. They are still not moved in the north or across the border into North Israel.
Well, I think their ability to act is probably a factor on this, and I think there's a lot of waiting and seeing what happens on all sides of this conflict in the Middle East. But I think absolutely what Tehran wants to see is instability in the Middle East. They don't want to see peace, and they are a very malign force in this situation.
Can I also ask you about what some people are saying is the growing threat here? I mean, MI5 saying they're paying very close attention to Islamists in the UK. There are people, I've spoken to them, who say, I can't bear to watch what's going on in the Middle East, but people need to understand there could be ramifications for us here. We do need to be very aware of what's going on.
Well, as a parent, it is absolutely heart-wrenching to see some of the scenes and some of the reports, just awful reports coming from the region. And we do, I think, need to understand what the situation is. But we also need to guard against raising tensions in our own communities. There's quite a division in this country as to whether people are supporting Palestine or supporting Israel. It's not as straightforward as that. Both sides.
Hamas is not Palestine.
And Hamas is not Palestine. Then there does need to be a distinction made between that. But I think what we saw on the streets of London over the weekend was very disturbing. Yesterday, or the other day, I raised in Parliament the fact that there was that protest stage inappropriately put up next to the Cenotaph, that national monuments were being destroyed by protesters.
And more protests, we believe, probably this afternoon at some stage. So a very difficult question for the police as to what they allow and what they don't allow, because part of the equation is that we have free speech in this country and people have the right to have their voices heard.
Well, people do have the right to free speech in this country, and absolutely rightly so. But what they don't have the right to do is intimidate people, to threaten people, to damage public property, to disrespect our war dead by erecting a stage right next to the Cenotaph. Who on earth gave permission for that? I suspect it was Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, but who on earth gave permission for that? There really does need to be a reckoning for that.
Yeah. It was marked at the beginning here of PMQs that both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer wanted the House to speak with one voice and to get that cross-party accord. We've not seen that for some time.
Well, I think there is a humanity response from most members of Parliament and the vast majority of people in this country that see huge suffering of innocent people caught up in this conflict. Of course, we want to de-escalate that, and we want to support those people who, through no fault of their own, have become caught up in this situation. But I suspect the unity that we're seeing in the immediate aftermath of what has happened in Gaza and Israel, there are differences underneath, and I think Particularly, we see this in the Labour Party, where I think there is quite a... the leader, of course, Keir Starmer has come out very strongly.
Are you talking about Jeremy Corbyn?
But well, not just Jeremy Corbyn. Right. Not just Jeremy Corbyn. I think there are large swathes of the Labour Party where the instinct is
not
to
that
support...
Jeremy Corbyn's a member of the Labour Party.
No, he's not. No, not anymore.
Yeah.
Remarkably, but I think that there are large sections of the Labour Party where perhaps the default position is to support the Palestinian position. Israel are historically at fault here. We do need to recognise that. Yeah. But also the terrorist hijacking of particularly the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and part of that Israeli difficulty is the West Bank. I think we've got some pictures coming in now of the situation on the West Bank, because we understand there are more protests. Well, there we are, underway there. And just to explain to people, of course, the Palestinian Authority still holds sway there, who did actually run Gaza until they were ousted, effectively, I guess you would say, by Hamas.
And the Palestinian president was due to meet with President Biden, and that has now been cancelled.
Well, President Abbas is in a very difficult situation. It's said that he's more loathed by the likes of Hamas than they actually loathe the Israelis. So this is not a binary situation.
Yeah, the charge against me is that he's abandoned the cause. That's what they say.
What we need to see is a multi-state solution in the Middle East. The fact was that the West Bank once was Jordanian, the Gaza Strip was once Egyptian. I don't know that those countries would want those territories back, but that might be a solution. But ultimately, there does need to be a Palestinian entity that is internationally recognised, and a safe and secure Israel as well. And the reason why I think we're seeing the actions that we are is because those who want discord and conflict in the Middle East don't want to see that growing peace and agreement, which we were seeing with the Abraham Accords.
The Palestinian flag flying here, substantial number, but we should add this is at the moment a peaceful protest. There are speeches and this is a gathering. I mean, could the situation be that Israel has to fight a struggle or a war on three fronts? What's happening in Gaza, if anything happens over the border from Lebanon, and then that the West Bank erupts as well?
Well, it won't be for the first time if that is the case. I mean, Israel is surrounded on three sides by large numbers of population that doesn't...
Would it spread their military too thin, though?
The state of Israel shouldn't exist. I think the IDF and Mossad have always been sort of considered to be sort of the absolute best, and I think what is deeply disturbing for the psyche of the Israeli state is that they didn't see this coming. And that's why I think the analogies are made with 9/11, where there was a security failure by the likes of the NSA and the CIA before 9/11. I think the fact that the Mossad and the IDF didn't see this coming is
and was slow to react as well. That's
deeply disturbing. To the state of Israel, and it must be a very worrying time to be living in Israel.
Well, we just lost our pictures there in the West Bank, but we'll keep monitoring that for you. Henry is with us for this afternoon, a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, of course, analysing the developments here. Still no news as to whether Rishi Sunak will be travelling to the Middle East, but we do know that President Biden is there. We'll be getting the latest reaction from Tel Aviv on what he may be achieving diplomatically. Latest coming up for you here on the live desk.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie, second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GBNews.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Of the West Bank. These are the live pictures of Gaza. You can see there the coastal strip down into the distance with the sea on the left-hand side. Now, you will remember that yesterday we saw rocket fire from to the left of this high-rise building here in the foreground. Many plumes as those rockets were fired about this time yesterday. No indication of that at the moment, but of course the question is, in terms of this hospital in Gaza, was it rocket fire from within Gaza itself that fell short and hit that hospital? A central question that's been addressed already at Prime Minister's Questions today.
And that blast happened as President Biden was on his way to Israel. He says that the blast last night appears to have been caused by the other team. Quite an interesting use of language there. The other team, he said. He has been meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There are very different versions of what happened last night.
Henry Smith is still with us here in the studio, a Conservative MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Does it actually matter now, in terms of finding the forensic detail of what happened, that the perception has already spread, the reaction has already spread, the blue touch paper, if you like, has been lit?
I think what we always need to have in the forefront of our minds is those innocent individuals, many children who have been killed or seriously wounded as a result of these attacks. That is absolutely what should be paramount. But it does matter to try and find out who caused that explosion over the hospital.
We're going to go back to the Commons. James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, answering an urgent question.
Which can, at best, be incomplete or, at worst, examples of active disinformation. We are carefully analysing the evidence that has been put in the public domain and other information, and as soon as we have reached a definitive conclusion for ourselves, we will make that public. However, there are some things which are not in doubt. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, set out, Hamas carried out a terrorist assault in Israel unprecedented in that country's 75-year history, and the whole House united in support of Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism. In defending itself, Israel must act with professionalism and with an unwavering commitment to international law. States must take every precaution to minimise civilian casualties and ensure humanitarian support reaches those in need. And I welcome President Herzog's unequivocal commitment, made both directly to me and in public, that Israel is operating in accordance with the rule of international law. By embedding themselves in civilian populations, by using innocent Palestinians as human shields, by launching thousands of rockets since Saturday from one of the most crowded places in the world and preventing civilians from heeding Israeli warnings about future areas of operation, Hamas reveals themselves and their callous indifference to human life. In this tense situation, UK diplomacy is relentlessly focused on our aims, and that is to support our nationals in their moment of need, to push and deliver humanitarian support, and working to prevent the tensions spilling over into the wider region or playing out on the streets of this country. I have travelled to Israel. I've engaged with G7 allies, regional partners, and will be visiting the region again later on today, because we recognise that this will require intensive effort. None of us know how this complex, protracted situation will develop. The government is committed to keeping the House updated, and both here in the UK and in the region, this is a time for cool heads and determination to make a positive difference.
David Lamb.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for granting this urgent question. I'm grateful to the Foreign Secretary for his engagement with the opposition at this very difficult time. Today we stand united in mourning the death of hundreds of innocent Palestinian civilians at the Al Ali Mosque. A place of healing, hospital, forgive me. A place of healing became a scene of destruction. Hospitals must always be protected. The death of every civilian, Palestinian or Israeli, is an equal tragedy that pushes back the cause of peace. When facing an incident of this magnitude, we all have a duty to act responsibly and judiciously as the facts are determined. Will the Foreign Secretary join me in urging everyone in this House and beyond to be wary of disinformation and to avoid dangerous speculation before the facts are clear? And on the point that the Foreign Secretary raises, will he also update the House on what he's doing to deal with outsized powers that might be seeking to drive division within our own shores? I know that the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have rightly said that they're working to establish the facts, looking at intelligence with our allies, and that must be right. We note also President Biden's comments earlier today. Can he confirm if the UK government shares that initial assessment? And I ask him to share what information he can with us, either publicly or on Privy Council terms. And does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that those responsible for the deaths at the Al Ali Hospital must be held to account? Since Hamas' appalling terrorist attack on Israel 11 days ago, Labour has been crystal clear. First, we support Israel's right to defend itself, rescue hostages and protect its citizens. Second, international law must be followed at all times. And third, civilians must not be targeted, aid provided and innocent lives protected. Gaza is in the middle of an active humanitarian emergency. Innocent Palestinian civilians are terrified for their lives. Can the Foreign Secretary today commit that the government will leave no stone unturned in its diplomatic efforts to secure humanitarian access to food, water, fuel, electricity and medicines, ensure the establishment of humanitarian corridors and the proper protection of humanitarian workers? Palestinian civilians in Gaza must know the world is not simply watching, but we are acting on their behalf.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a number of incredibly important points, and I commend the House to listen to the points that he made, a number of which I will respond to and indeed amplify. He is absolutely right that this is an incredibly sensitive situation, not just for the region itself, and our desire to prevent this tragedy expanding into a regional conflict remains an absolute priority. And of course we have a duty as a government, and it's a passion I'm sure shared by the whole House, to ensure that Jewish communities in the UK, Muslim communities in the UK are safe and feel safe and do not experience ramifications of circumstances far beyond these shores and beyond their control. For that reason, everybody, particularly those who have a voice, whether formal or informal, in the public sphere, should be particularly careful of what information they disseminate. They should be particularly vigilant against disinformation, and speculation is never useful. I appreciate that the House and indeed the country will want to understand what is going on in real time, and sometimes the pause that we impose upon ourselves to make sure the information the government provides is accurate can be frustrating, but I would prefer, of course, to be accurate rather than just work at pace. And he's right that there are malign influences seeking to take advantage of this terrible situation. We do guard ourselves against that. We take note of what President Biden has said, but we will come to our own judgment. We will work on that quickly, and we will ensure that our assessment is put in the public domain as soon as we are confident of the details.
Fire of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
As the Foreign Secretary said, we should soon know the direct cause of this explosion. I'll send on to him and the Prime Minister a letter I've received from the Worthing Islamic Society. I think Jewish people and others in my constituency will agree with every sentence, but it ends up by saying, will the government please use their influence and support to encourage a peaceful and sustainable resolution that prioritises the rights and well-being of innocent citizens caught up in the onslaught?
Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House makes an incredibly important point. And as a former minister for the Middle East, I'm acutely conscious of the implications for Islamic communities, both in the region and here in the UK. And the protection of those people are as close to our hearts as the protection of Jewish people here in the UK.
Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, they're reacting to that question, that comment from Peter Bottomley from his own constituency there in Worthing. But the interesting aspect to what Mr. Cleverly has just been talking about is that he came out with this line, I will be visiting the region again today. Henry is still with us here in the studio. Henry Smith, MP and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. We were thinking that Rishi Sunak will be going perhaps tomorrow, but Mr. Cleverly indicating he's on his way this afternoon. Could that be with the Prime Minister?
I don't know. I suspect the Prime Minister will be visiting the region, but I think it's important that at least the Foreign Secretary is going back, because I think Britain has an important role to play in seeking a solution to this crisis.
And only there last week, of course. Let's just remember that.
Indeed so. And, of course, many people visiting London as well. We mentioned the King of Jordan being here a few days ago, and conversations going on with the Qataris as well.
And is your thinking that it is the humanitarian aspect and those hostages really at the front at the moment? Because clearly, the big diplomatic strings are being pulled by Washington and President Biden.
Inevitably, I think the influence of Washington is the most acute. Let's not forget, it was under the Trump administration that the Abraham Accords were first brought into effect with some of those Gulf states. But I think the United Kingdom has an important role to play. We are very well respected in the region. And as I say, we've got a lot of history. Of course, Palestine was a British mandate before the creation of the
we were directly involved in 1948.
And we have an important role, I think, still to play, both in terms of diplomatic efforts to end this conflict, longer-term resolution to the problem, although that is a much bigger ask, and in the immediacy, I think, making sure those hostages are freed and humanitarian help.
On this humanitarian help, the government is saying that they believe that Israel is acting within international law. Now, that is being questioned by UN chiefs. It's also being questioned by lawyers, by legal scholars. The forcible transfer of civilians, it has been suggested, is not acting within international law.
I think it's important that how Israel and the IDF respond to this is monitored to make sure that international law is being respected. As both President Biden and the Prime Minister here has said, that democracies, when they apply and abide by the rules, actually strengthen the case for democracy. We act in a responsible way, and Israel is a democracy, the only true democracy in the Middle East, and I expect them to act in accordance with international law.
Yeah, and is part of what James Cleverly will have to piece together now is the reaction after this attack on the hospital, the explosion, and that is the position of Saudi Arabia, the position of Egypt, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and of course the reflection on what Iran does next. I mean, there's a big jigsaw to put together here.
At the moment, Iran and Iran's proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah and others, are winning this conflict in the sense that they have created discord in the Middle East. They have created conflict in the Middle East. We are seeing now a pause, I think, from the likes of Saudi Arabia in terms of being one of those Abraham Accords countries. We're even seeing some words from long-time countries that have been at peace with Israel, such as Jordan, King Abdullah expressing concern. A lot of that they have to do for their domestic population and consumption. Otherwise, they will find themselves potentially in a very difficult situation. But right now, the malign forces are winning, and we need to remind ourselves of that, that the likes of Iran, along with Russia and also countries like China, are looking for disharmony. They're looking to disrupt Western democracies and our well-being in all sorts of ways. And we need to shine a spotlight on that.
Henry Smith, thank you very much for being with us this hour from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Of course, James Cleverly's still there on his feet, but that breaking news that he is planning to visit the region again today. We'll have the very latest for you from Westminster. Stay with us here on the live desk.
Hi there, it's Aidan McKibben here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. Storm Babet is moving through over the next few days, bringing wet and windy weather to much of the UK, particularly towards the north. But the reason Babet has been named is because of the risk of truly exceptional amounts of rainfall across eastern Scotland in particular during Thursday and into Friday. At first, the rain is affecting Wales, the south of England, and during the rest of Wednesday, that rain moves into West Wales, North Wales, the Midlands, as well as eventually Northern Ireland. It's going to be heavy in the south with a strong wind, not feeling very pleasant here. Further north, a bright day to come for Scotland, North and East England, and the wind's picking up through the day as well, but nothing particularly severe at this stage. The swirl in the south, though, that's Storm Babet, and through the night, the heavy rain pushes into Northern Ireland, could cause some impacts here. Then Northern England, southern Scotland. Further showery rain emerges in the south, and it's a mild night for most of us with a strong wind, cloud and outbreaks of rain. But really it's through Thursday that rain just becomes persistent and heavy across eastern Scotland in particular, Angus and Aberdeenshire, especially over the higher ground in the east. We're going to see some very, very large rainfall totals, could cause some significant and widespread flooding. Warnings are in force.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Good afternoon. It is 1 o'clock. This is the live desk on GB News. Coming up for you this Wednesday lunchtime.
Rishi Sunak tells the Commons the UK is working hard to establish exactly what happened at the Gaza Baptist Hospital. James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, reveals he's travelling back to the Middle East later today. We'll have the latest analysis coming up.
Earlier, President Joe Biden arrived in Israel and held talks with the Israeli Prime Minister. The US president reiterated his support for Israel and blamed last night's hospital explosion on what he referred to as the other team.
And we'll have a GB News exclusive with our reporter Charlie Peters in Tel Aviv speaking to a British-Israeli IDF officer who was wounded while fighting the Hamas terrorists at a kibbutz in southern Israel.
Plus, what impact could this conflict have on UK inflation? It has unexpectedly held steady amid rising fuel prices. What does it all mean? We'll be exploring that with our business and economics editor, Liam Halligan. First, let's get your headlines with Rhiannon.
Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 1. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The crisis in Gaza and Israel dominated Prime Minister's questions today after a month's break for the party conferences. Both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer struck a similar tone, condemning the actions of Hamas whilst reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself. In this, they stood united. With the casualties in Gaza mounting, both leaders expressed their sympathies with the Palestinian people following the overnight blast at the Al Ali Arabi hospital, which killed 500 people. At Prime Minister's questions, the Labour leader sent his condolences to the people of Gaza.
Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House.
Well, US President Joe Biden has met with the Israeli Prime Minister. He's meant to be on a diplomatic mission to prevent an escalation in the region. But after the strike on the Al Ali Hospital in Gaza, a planned meeting with leaders in the Middle East has been cancelled. In a joint press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, President Biden supported the Israeli Defense Forces' claims that the rocket fired was not from Israel and again pledged US support.
Israel, as they respond to these attacks, it seems to me that have to continue to ensure that you have what you need to defend yourselves. And we're going to make sure that occurs, as you know. I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
Well, a Hamas official, meanwhile, has said the US and Western countries supporting Israel hold full responsibility for what he described as a war against civilians in Gaza. His comments come as another funeral's held to mourn the victims killed during an overnight bombardment in the south of the Gaza Strip. One angry mourner in Khan Yunis also pointed the finger at the US.
President Biden and his administration, generations will not forget, and history will be recorded, that it was your administration, your billions of dollars, your support with weapons of mass destruction to the Israeli Defense Forces, which has caused what is happening right now in Gaza.
In other news back here, the rate of inflation remained at 6.7% last month as easing food and drink price rises were offset by higher petrol and diesel prices. The Office for National Statistics says inflation stayed at the same rate despite expectations it would fall again. The reading's important in calculating how much benefit payments will increase next year, as well as some taxes. 10 current and former police officers and staff are being investigated by a police watchdog for their handling of allegations against serial rapist David Carrick. The 48-year-old was jailed for life with a minimum term of 32 years after carrying out what the court heard was a catalogue of violent and brutal sex attacks between 2003 and 2020. And a man who abducted a young girl as she walked home in the Scottish borders and then sexually assaulted her has been jailed for 20 years. The High Court in Edinburgh heard Andrew Miller, also known as Amy George, was dressed as a woman when he offered the girl a lift in February this year. The 53-year-old instead drove her to his home where he sexually abused her for 27 hours. Greta Thunberg has been charged with a public order offence after her arrest during a fossil-free London protest. The 20-year-old's accused of breaching a Section 14 order put in place by police outside the Intercontinental Hotel in central London, where oil executives were meeting on Tuesday. 27 protesters were arrested in total and 26 charged. Greta Thunberg's been released on bail with a trial set for the 15th of November. And a red weather warning for rain has been issued by the Met Office for parts of Scotland. It means very dangerous weather is expected, with extensive flooding likely to pose a risk to life. The weather warning runs from 6 p.m. tomorrow until noon on Friday. And the British Museum has announced plans to digitise its collection following the theft of some items. The museum says the project will take 5 years, with the entire collection accessible online to anyone who wants to explore it. Around 2,000 treasures are thought to have been stolen from the British Museum, with 350 or so recovered so far. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car and digital radio, and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back over to Mark and Pip.
Let's take you straight back to the latest live pictures we're getting from Gaza. There appears to be some activity on this rooftop that we assume will be some kind of water tank there on the roof. But we have seen smoke as well, more explosions on the Gaza skyline. Indications, of course, that the hostilities continue even as President Biden is meeting Benjamin Netanyahu to try and move diplomacy forward. And we did hear in the Commons just minutes ago that Rishi Sunak said the UK was trying to independently verify with its allies what had happened at the hospital in Gaza, this Baptist hospital, with the Gaza Health Ministry now claiming that 471 Palestinians were killed in what they termed an Israeli massacre. But of course, that's being questioned by others. President Biden, in that discussion with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying it appeared that the other team were responsible, but clearly questions as to what happened at that hospital as we see more smoke there in Gaza.
Well, let's talk to Charlie Peters, our reporter who is on the ground in Tel Aviv. Good afternoon to you, Charlie. President Biden has been holding that press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, and he used that interesting language saying that the hospital blast, he believes, was caused by the other team, i.e. not Israel. Interesting use of words. Almost sounds like two opposing football teams.
Yes, it was extremely colloquial, and there has been quite a negative reaction to that term in Tel Aviv because, of course, last week when Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with the Israeli leaders, he said there can be absolutely no equivocation whatsoever between the Israelis' right to defend themselves and the Hamas terrorist violence over the weekend of October the 7th. But to call them the other team does in some way put them on equal moral footing, or at least in some sense that they are equal sides in this conflict. They certainly don't see it that way in Israel. But President Biden's arrival in this country has already had some sort of diplomatic effect on the ground, with this morning the Israelis announcing a humanitarian safe zone inside the Gaza Strip on the coast in Al-Muwazi, somewhere near the Khan Yunis city in the south of Gaza. This has been a serious demand of American diplomacy since this war started, as the blockade continues on the Gaza Strip, preventing water and food from getting into so many people forced to move, internally displaced amid the violence. Americans have demanded the Israelis put in those humanitarian safe zones, and they finally, it seems, established that. I mean, I asked the IDF this morning how they would maintain that safe zone. How would they get food and aid to that location? How would they get water, which has previously been promised to those in the south of the Gaza Strip? They said they are still checking to confirm how it would be established. They've also yet to confirm to me how they would allow people within the Gaza Strip to get to that new so-called humanitarian safe zone effectively. Last week, there were several occasions when the IDF extended their deadline for movement from the north to the south with what they called humanitarian safe corridors, particularly down the main supply route inland. And they haven't announced the same for people near the Rafah crossing to move several kilometres into the west towards that border, that coastal area where the humanitarian safe zone is. But across the region, there has also been a reaction to the arrival of Joe Biden. In the last 2 hours, a source to a news agency said that the Americans have intercepted 2 drones above Iraq that they said were targeting American capabilities. Now, we know that the Popular Mobilization Forces, these are Iran-backed proxies in Iraq, have been active for many years targeting US-supported authorities inside Iraq. And this is the first time that the Americans have intercepted drones over Iraqi airspace targeting their own for a year. So this is a significant development and possibly comes at a time as Iran is trying to flex its muscles and show that its proxies in the so-called Shia Crescent from Tehran all the way to Lebanon are active, are ready, and can escalate the situation should what they think the worst would be, which is that Israeli ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. And I'll just say one more final thing, that in Tel Aviv, there is an increasing feeling that the window of opportunity for that ground invasion after last night's situation in the Baptist hospital in North Gaza, that window has shrunk from months to possibly just days, if at all. What last night was being described as a as a failure by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in terms of the launch failing, they claim, over the north of Gaza City could turn out to be a great success for the information war for Hamas and other terrorists in the north of the Gaza Strip, because it has generated this regional-wide concern, attributing the blame to Israel and creating a ginormous sense of Arab solidarity, who essentially seem to be saying, all these nations, Jordan, Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, saying to the US and Israel, enough is enough. Do not take this further, even though, as the IDF are saying this morning, with compelling but not conclusive evidence, it wasn't us. You blew up your own people with that launch from the north of Gaza.
Charlie, we've got PMQs, of course, having taken place here at Westminster. The Prime Minister saying British intelligence trying to establish exactly what happened. We've also got the Prime Minister's spokesman in the last few minutes saying or confirming 7 British nationals killed and at least 9 missing since Hamas launched the attack. We also had the Prime Minister saying he's spoken to the Emir of Qatar using contacts in the region, and now James cleverly indicating he's heading back there later today. Do we take it that at the moment the hostages are at the top of the list?
That is a serious part of the agenda here, of course. The Israelis consistently saying that it will be a relentless effort on their part to retrieve those hostages. And we know there have been attempts at inter-regional diplomacy to establish some way that they can be released. But of course, they are at loggerheads, the Hamas side and the Israelis here, on how they deal with that hostage situation. Hamas say they will release hostages when the bombardment stops, whereas the Israelis are saying they'll stop their bombardment when you release hostages. So it's highly unlikely that a release of hostages will be achieved by diplomatic means as this conflict continues. But of course, it is the main focus of diplomacy after securing that humanitarian aid to the thousands, hundreds of thousands moving south and stuck in such grave violence. People in Israel are also very concerned about how the state is operating inside the Gaza Strip with regards to forcing so many people to move around in such precarious conditions. All these safe corridors, this big order to move south, this new safe zone by the West. There are so many conflicting and updating demands being made on the internally displaced people inside the Gaza Strip. Can they make it to this safe zone now, and will it remain safe? These are questions that have yet to be answered.
Charlie, in Tel Aviv, thank you for updating us. Back to you, of course, throughout the afternoon to get the very latest there in Israel.
Let's get the thoughts now of the head of development at Global Relief Trust, Attica Rahman, as we continue showing you those latest pictures from Gaza. Good afternoon to you, Attica. Thanks for talking to us. In light of this blast, we understand last night, that has killed hundreds of people, how much worse has it made this situation on the ground? And also, I just want to ask you about the stories we're hearing about people who moved south to find refuge but are now actually heading back north because they feel that they're not safe anywhere.
Like yourself and many people who the news broke of this devastating attack at a hospital, it was absolutely shocking. Yesterday, my phone just didn't stop, and the first priority was to find out how our team in Gaza were doing. Fortunately, they are okay. Unfortunately, hundreds have been killed on an attack at a hospital. Now, this has happened. We're talking about people moving back to the north because they said, well, we might as well die in dignity rather than dying in hospitals and schools. We know that from Yusuf, who's working as a frontline paramedic in Gaza, that people who were fleeing from the north, traveling to the south, a convoy of cars was attacked a few days ago when the evacuation order was made. And in fact, Yusuf was actually one of the first responders at that scene, and his ambulance was purposely and deliberately hit. Luckily, he was away from the ambulance. Unfortunately, the patients that were in his ambulance died. So this is the situation. We know that UN schools have been hit in the last 24 hours. And we also know there's been a hospital that's been hit. So people who were staying in the grounds of that hospital, who were fleeing from the heavy bombardment, who were told to get away from the north, were actually massacred last night. And people are thinking, well, if we're going to die in the hospitals and if we're going to die in the schools, then we might as well go back and die in our homes because there's nowhere to escape. where are people running off to? You know, it's not like there's a safe zone. There's a no-fly zone. There's nothing like that. People are dying left, right, centre here.
As we understand it, the border crossing in the south, the Rafah crossing, still closed. We understand that might be one of the priorities for President Biden as he speaks to Benjamin Netanyahu, and of course trying to get some accord with President al-Sisi in Egypt. What would happen if the border opens? We keep being told that there's a huge amount of aid ready to come over the border from Egypt.
I mean, the question that needs to be asked is not when is he being opened. It's why hasn't he yet been opened? You know, if Gaza Strip was in Europe, this would have been opened within the 24 hours. You know, we're now talking 10, 11, 12 days of this conflict, and it's still short. You know, we're hospitals are literally operating on children and amputating. I've got the footages on my phone. You know, there's no verification needed. There are children who are having their arms and legs amputated without medicine on hospital floors. This is a reality. Now, if this isn't enough to open these borders to let aid in, we're not asking for anything else. We're asking for simple, basic necessities to preserve life. And yeah, we want these to be open, and we hope it can be open straight away so we can get the aid in to literally help save lives. There's water, you know, this is the essential of life. You know, you can't do anything without water. You know, we're talking about in the south of Gaza that it was announced that water was switched back on. Well, actually, without electricity, how can you pump any water into the systems anyway? So it was very well said, but actually in reality it did not help the people. We're aware that just several kilometers away from the hospital yesterday, a bakery was hit where 2 people were killed. Now, this is a bakery that was just providing bread to the daily to people for their daily bread, and it's a bakery that we were actually working with to get bread to people. And that's been destroyed. There was queues, they saying, of 3-4 hours at a time of people waiting just to get a piece of bread, and that's now been destroyed. So we, you know, if bombs aren't killing these people, let's starve them. If starving isn't going to kill these people, well, you know what? Let them die in hunger.
Yeah, although we should make it plain, of course, that as we've heard from Rishi Sunak, moves underway to try and establish, obviously, where the fire is coming from. It is still unclear as to whether people are being hit by rockets from within Gaza or elsewhere. So that is a difficult position. But
I must say that there is a pattern of denying something. We've seen this with the Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen that was shot dead and killed, and there was total deniability for the several days until it was made clear that thing is. However, look, this isn't about taking sides here. The fact is, a bomb has gone off at a hospital, and children and people have been killed. Innocent civilians have been killed. And if we're sitting here to blame one side or the other, we'll be here for the next few weeks. This is 2023. We are sitting in front of TV screens, tablets and mobile phones, and actually witnessing and watching genocide taking place.
As we speak to you, we're just seeing some more smoke on the skyline further south. This is from Sderot on the Israeli side, looking into Gaza. We understand from James Cleary, the Foreign Secretary, that he's travelling back out there later today. We assume that the question of the hostages will be very much to the forefront. But clearly, from what you're saying, it's the international humanitarian and aid operation that really needs to be addressed as well.
Look, there should not be the humanitarian side should not be a pretext for any other agreement. You know, you cannot do medieval practices of sieging. You know what they used to do and sieging a castle and let people starve. This is 2023. We cannot allow, and we are allowing, unfortunately, the millions of people to be starved. And on top of that, when they are being bombed, you know, whichever side, the fact is people are being bombed and they cannot get medical treatment because the hospitals have no electricity, they have no medicine, and they don't have any fuel to even keep the generators going.
Attica, is there any access at all to bottled water for people?
Well, there's going to be shortages. You know, we're talking 2.3 million people are in need of water. 3 of the huge desalination units that were providing water to Gaza has been destroyed out of the 5, and there's no electricity. So even with the desalination units, which is taking water out of the sea, is out of use, because what we do know, which is a fact, is that the water system in Gaza has been deliberately poisoned with sewage, so people cannot drink tap water there either. So there's only going to be limited water. We're seeing people drinking salt water, seawater from the ground. That we know, give this to a 6-month-old child. You can just imagine the damage it's going to do to organs and the child's future.
From what we understand, there is convoy upon convoy of aid waiting at the Rafah crossing. It's just got to get in, which is something that James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, says he will be working on.
This is a priority. I mean, we're hearing there's miles and miles of aid waiting to go in, and I still have not seen any world leaders. They're talking about it, but they need to force that. There needs to be a ceasefire to allow people to receive the aid. This needs to be forced in some shape or form on either side to say, listen, stop fighting and help the people. Otherwise, you are going to have a catastrophe. There are thousands of bodies that are buried under rubble. There is a shortage of water. There is a long-term issue when it comes to waterborne diseases and sanitation. So we need to get this aid in, and we don't need to get this in tomorrow. It needs to get in right now.
Atika Rahman, Head of Development at the Global Relief Trust. Thanks for bringing us the latest, what you understand it to be. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll reflect on the political situation. Still questions as to whether Rishi Sunak will travel out to the Middle East, but confirmation from James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, he is on his way later. What will he be attempting to achieve? We'll update you. Stay with us here on the Live Desk.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to the live desk. We can show you pictures from the West Bank now, from Beit El. Palestinians taking to the streets. They have been protesting and are continuing to protest in support of Gaza after that blast last night. Thousands of Palestinians have been chanting during the protests. A general strike and a three-day mourning period has been announced by the Palestinian president.
Yeah, there have been other protests, marches, speeches at Ramallah and Nablus. Just to remind you, the West Bank, of course, controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and there is some unease at the position of the leadership in terms of what's happened in Gaza. Indication, of course, earlier that the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas would not be meeting President Biden after the explosion at the hospital in Gaza. But you can see here that it is, I think, largely youths we can see in the foreground of the picture with a burning barricade there, but limited in numbers. We did see much larger numbers elsewhere in Ramallah and Nablus, but they were largely peaceful, and certainly the Palestinian flag flying. But this is one of the worries that, of course, the troubles now could re-erupt on the West Bank, as well as in Gaza, and then on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. So we'll keep monitoring the situation and update you.
Well, during PMQs earlier, the Prime Minister said that Parliament speaks with one voice in condemning Hamas for causing untold suffering. And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has confirmed that he will be returning to the Middle East later today. He was only there last week, as efforts continue to prevent the conflict escalating.
Let's get more from Westminster, and our political correspondent there, Catherine Forster, has been following developments. Confirmation then, Catherine, that Cleverly is on his way again, but still no confirmation about Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and where he'll be travelling as well.
Yes, that's right. We did hear yesterday that Rishi Sunak might have been travelling to Israel as soon as tomorrow. But that, of course, was before the horrific bombing overnight of the hospital, and the question as to who is responsible, we still do not have the answers. Now, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who's been addressing the House, saying that he is heading back to Israel today, but we don't know when Rishi Sunak will be going. But certainly a very different and a very sombre tone in Prime Minister's questions, the first one in about a month since before the party conferences. Feels like the world has shifted rather since then. United Labour and Conservatives and the Scottish National Party in condemning civilian deaths, saying that civilians must be protected, and that Israel, of course, has this terrible atrocity visited upon it and has the right to defend itself. Some differences, I think, emerging, all of them stressing that civilian casualties must be minimised. So Keir Starmer saying a couple of times that international law must be upheld, and Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader of the Scottish National Party, going further still, echoing what Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf said yesterday, saying, calling for an immediate ceasefire, something that Rishi Sunak did not take the chance to agree with, and also stressing that there must be no collective punishment, an implication perhaps that in the blockade of Gaza, of the blocking of food, of water, of fuel, of power, and the forced relocation of 1.1 million people, that perhaps that does amount to collective punishment. So some subtle differences, but largely a unified response, an absolute horror of what is going on. And despite all the calls for humanitarian aid to get into Gaza, for the Rafah crossing to open up, no opening of that crossing, none of the aid that is amassing around the country actually getting in.
Catherine, thank you for that. As we look at the latest pictures from Sderot in southern Israel, looking into Gaza Strip, as we see more smoke there on the horizon, indications of more explosions. We'll update you with the latest live from the scene, but let's get the latest news headlines now with Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mark. It's 1:33, your top stories from the GB newsroom. And we start with the breaking news that at least 7 British nationals have been killed and 9 are missing since Hamas's attack on Israel. That's been confirmed by a spokesperson for the Prime Minister. Well, earlier at PMQs, the crisis in Gaza and Israel dominated. Both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer struck a similar tone, condemning the actions of Hamas whilst reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself. In this, they stood united. With the casualties in Gaza mounting, both leaders expressed their sympathies with the Palestinian people following the overnight blast at the Al Ali Arabi hospital, which killed 500 people. The US President Joe Biden has met with the Israeli Prime Minister. He's meant to be on a diplomatic mission to prevent an escalation in the region. But after the strike on the Al Ali hospital in Gaza, a planned meeting with leaders in the Middle East has been cancelled. In a joint press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, President Biden supported the Israeli Defense Forces' claims that the rocket fired was not from Israel and again pledged US support for Israel. In other news, the rate of inflation remained at 6.7% last month, as easing food and drink price rises were offset by higher petrol and diesel prices. The Office for National Statistics says inflation stayed at the same rate despite expectations it would fall again. The reading's important in calculating how much benefit payments will increase next year, as well as some taxes. And a red weather warning for rain has been issued by the Met Office for parts of Scotland. It means very dangerous weather's expected, with extensive flooding likely to pose a risk to life. The weather warning runs from 6 p.m. tomorrow until noon on Friday. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
For a valuable legacy your family can own, gold coins will always shine bright. Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2200 and €1.1548. The price of gold is £1,597.27 per ounce, and the FTSE 100's at 7,630 points.
Rosalind Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Acquia, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new teeth. It's your new teeth.
I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to the live desk. If you were hoping that the cost of living crisis was over, well, think again. Inflation has flatlined, remaining at 6.7% last month. That is according to new figures from the Office for National Statistics.
Well, of course, with the situation in the Middle East, it's the question about the oil price that will be key from now on. So let's get the latest on the prices and the thoughts about where we're going with our economics editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money.
Inflation rarely falls in a straight line, but if we stick to our plan, we can expect inflation to keep falling this year. So said Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, soon after these new inflation figures were released this morning. But what do they actually say? Let's have a look at the numbers. In September 2023, a basket of goods and services was 6.7% more expensive than the same month in 2022. That's the same figure as it was in August and only slightly down on July. 6.7, 6.7 and 6.8. That's why we say inflation is flatlining. In the UK, inflation is still high compared to other Western countries. We see here that we're at 6.7 in the UK. In the Eurozone, it's 4.3% over there on continental Europe. And US inflation is 3.7%, much, much lower than here in Britain, not least because the US has much, much cheaper energy than we do. What's driving inflation here in the UK? Well, a lot of it, I'm afraid, it's food prices. Food price inflation was 12.1% in September. That means a basket of food was 12.1% more expensive than September 2022. That's down, though, from 13.6% food price inflation in August. So still high, but at least going in the right direction. Then there was fuel, particularly petrol and diesel, as any van driver will tell you. Petrol was 5.1% up on August in September. It averaged $1.53 a litre, and diesel rose 6.3% in a month, up to an average of $1.57 per litre. These expensive petrol and diesel costs are feeding right into inflation. But here's some good news, which I've been pointing out in recent months. Producer prices, these are in the fine print of the Office for National Statistics numbers. Back in October 2022, producer prices, that's the cost of the inputs that firms need to provide the goods and services that they then sell us. Producer price inflation this time last year was a whopping 24.1% compared to the year before, not least because energy prices were spiralling in the aftermath of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. But look at producer price inflation now. It's negative, minus 2.6%. That means that the inputs that firms use are getting cheaper, and eventually those costs will be passed on, they'll be lower, and that will lead to not only lower inflation, but actual falls in the level of prices. So what does all this mean for the Bank of England and interest rates? Mortgage holders want to know. They want lower interest rates. But if you're a saver, you probably want interest rates to go up. Well, the next time the Monetary Policy Committee meets, it's only in just over a week. It's Thursday, the 2nd of November. Back in December 21, rates were all the way down at 0.1% at those emergency post-pandemic levels. Since then, we've had 14 interest rate rises, all the way up to 5.25%. Well, the fact that inflation has stayed level this month means that the Bank of England may hesitate. It may actually think that inflation may go up. It may raise interest rates one more time to 5.5%. On the other hand, it could keep rates where they are. Financial markets are on a knife edge. No one knows which way this is going to go. It will probably be a split decision, and we'll see in just a couple of weeks' time. But there is some kind of issue on the horizon, storm clouds, in the form of the oil price. The oil price has gone up from $70 a barrel in June 2023 up to $90 and more, an enormous percentage increase in just a few months. And as if oil prices continue to go up, then that will feed directly into inflation. Could this conflagration in the Middle East lead to higher oil prices? It certainly could, because so much oil is in the Middle East. These are the Straits of Hormuz. This is the Persian Gulf. This is Iran, UAE, two major oil producers. Saudi's just over here. These tankers carry almost 20% of the world's oil supply every single day through this pinch point onto the Indian Ocean and global markets. This is the windpipe of the global economy. If this is blocked, a great deal of oil can't get out to international markets, and the global economy will splutter as inflation goes up as the oil price spikes. The danger is, with Iran telling the Americans that they want to fight this war on other fronts, telling them that Israel's time is up, that's literally a quote. The fear is that Iran may mine this area, blocking the Straits of Hormuz and holding the world economy to hostage. That is a big fear in the oil markets today. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's certainly concerns that it could. So where are we? We are still an inflation nation here in the UK. We have relatively high inflation, but it's certainly going in the right direction. Back in January, Rishi Sunak pledged, when inflation was about 10.5%, that he would halve it by the end of the year. So that means 5% by December. If he reaches that target, he'll have more credibility and he'll have more appeal to voters. If he doesn't reach that target, then these Labour gains over the Tories are set to continue.
Liam, thanks very much indeed. And of course, we'll keep an eye on that oil price and the economic fallout, what's happening in the Middle East, with President Biden still meeting Benjamin Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, we believe, after assuring at their joint news conference earlier that that hospital explosion in Gaza was, quote, done by the other team in Washington's view. The authorities in Gaza, meanwhile, saying 477 people were killed in that explosion.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak earlier told the Commons that the UK would try to independently verify who was behind the attack, with James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, calling for cool heads and announcing that he will be heading back to Israel for talks.
Let's speak now to Professor Yossi Mekelberg, who's Associate Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Yossi. Of course, this has derailed those four-way talks that Biden was hoping for to try and find a way forward. So has the damage already been done, despite what they tried to achieve in terms of the details of this hospital explosion?
Hello. Yes, I think that's completely derailed the initial objectives of this visit, because I think it was supposed to, on different levels, reasserting also US influence in the region. And on the one hand, expressing its support, reassure Israel that it's behind it, whether it's in the case of fighting Hamas, but also in case of Iran, Hezbollah are joining in. At the same time, also to reassure other countries, especially those that are normalized or have peace agreements with Israel, that not letting Israel or warning Israel not to reoccupy Gaza, avoiding a humanitarian crisis or even a disaster there. And here happens what happens in war. Events are actually taking over any strategies, assuming that there was one to begin with. And when you have, as you just mentioned, nearly 500 people killed, whoever did it, this brings all the kind of calculus in a different place.
So what do you think, Yossi, that President Biden could achieve here? Would it be getting the humanitarian aid in? Although we are just now hearing from Egypt, the Egyptian president saying that Egyptians in their millions would reject the forced displacement of Palestinians into Sinai. That appears to be why that Rafah crossing is still closed. But is that, do you think, President Biden's focus now helping with that humanitarian aid? Because, of course, he does have quite a long and complicated relationship with the Israeli Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that kind of the spontaneous decision to visit Israel and to make 11 hours flight to Israel for a few hours of visiting was a clear message of support in Israel. But at the same time, from the beginning, the United States expressed its reservations if Israel response will be disproportionate and if it's going actually to exacerbate the situation on the ground by killing many civilians. And the idea also, every war needs to have also a political objective. And again, that's where the Israel's Palestinians, the region and the international community as a whole failed. This conflict failed the people by not looking for a solution for years, abandoning the conflict. Now, if you fast forward, we are in a different situation right now.
Yeah.
And to ensure that it's not deteriorating even further in a way that is going to affect the stability in other countries in the region, and specifically what you're asking about refugees, bear in mind, the majority, around 1.3 million out of the 2.2 million people that live in Gaza are already refugees from previous wars. So make them refugees again. This is probably why Egypt knows that refugees are not a temporary situation anymore. In another 75 years, they will still be in Egypt.
Yossi, navigate the diplomatic landscape for us, if you will. The Abraham Accords, of course, signed with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, hoping to extend to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has now pulled back, it seems, from the situation. Jordan indicating now, having pulled out these talks, that King Abdullah is worried about the situation in his own country. We've just discussed Egypt. Qatar. We had Rishi Sunak at Prime Minister's Questions indicating he spoke to the Emir of Qatar using his contacts in the region. Is that the only channel left at the moment to try and move this forward?
I think there are other channels, for instance, between Egypt and Hamas, and definitely between Jordan and the Palestinians in the West Bank, the PA. So there are other channels to work on. But yes, what happened in the 7th of October changed much of the parameters of discussion. Now, when we look at the normalization that you mentioned, there is a logic to the Abraham Accord. There is a logic to Saudi Arabia and Israel normalizing their relations because it serves their interest. But the sentiment in the street in many places in the Arab world is with the Palestinians because they live under occupation, they live under blockade, they're oppressed. And as a result of it, when something like this happen, you see the fault on the narratives. Again, we don't know exactly what happened in the hospital in Gaza. What we know that it's a major disaster, that many innocent people paid with their lives. But the sides already subscribe to their preconceived ideas. And that's exactly the kind of the vicious cycle that needs to be broken.
Yeah, and the perceptions, of course, that continue. Professor Yossi Meckelberg, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts with us on GB News this afternoon. Thank you.
Jeremy Isaacharov is an Israeli diplomat and former ambassador to Germany who can join us now. Good afternoon to you, Jeremy. This hospital blast last night has made things even so incredibly more difficult than they already are. What do you think could be achieved by President Biden today, by Britain's Foreign Secretary heading in later today? Where do you think we're at now in terms of, as Mark suggested earlier, moving things forward?
Let's go bit by bit on your question. There's a lot of aspects to it. First of all, regarding the hospital blast in Al-Ali in Gaza, there is clear evidence that has been presented now by the IDF spokesman and also by independent media, Israeli media, that was following the actual events on the ground as rockets were being launched towards Israel, that shows that this explosion emanated from a launch of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. One of their rockets hit a car park near the hospital, and it's their responsibility. Israel was not active in that area, and this has been made abundantly clear. And President Biden said in his photo op with the Prime Minister that this was done by the other side, meaning that it was done by as a result of a failed launch on their side. So I think that is one thing, and I think it would have been very appropriate for a lot of media channels, including some British ones, not yours necessarily, to have been a lot more careful in jumping to conclusions that this was an attack by an by the Israeli Air Force. As I said, there's clear evidence to the contrary. The meeting with President Biden has been incredibly important in terms of maintaining Israel and America's strategic alliance and partnership, and also consulting regarding what is happening on the ground. Don't forget, we have almost 200 hostages, including some American citizens and quite possibly British citizens,
yes,
that we are very focused on in terms of getting their immediate and unconditional release.
Yeah, but can I pick up on what we heard from Professor Meckelberg, and that is that the attack, whoever we eventually find out was behind it, has changed the whole picture diplomatically, because clearly Biden was hoping for these four-way talks. They have now had to be shelved. We've seen the unrest growing now on the West Bank and elsewhere. The perception of what happened has set everything back. There has to be a reset.
Okay, but that is, first of all, I'm not so sure that this sets back the entire diplomacy around this whole crisis.
Okay.
We'll continue to talk to the United States. The United States will continue to talk to the players in the region. And also, yesterday we hosted the Chancellor of Germany. And as you said, the British Prime Minister will be visiting soon. So I think, look, one of the major answers that we have as a result of this crisis is to bring and ensure that the Middle East ends up a lot more stable than it has been up till now. Up till now, we have tolerated Hamas in Gaza, thinking that it can be deterred, and we saw the results on the 7th of October. And the results were a massacre of our people, 1,400 people killed mercilessly, men, women, children, babies. This cannot happen again. And I think that one of the broader aspects is that Hamas has been supported by Iran, and Iran's fear of broadening of normalization in the Middle East is clear. They are not interested in it. And maybe they use this attack in order to prevent that normalization.
Thank you for that. We're out of time, but thank you for your assessment. We'll speak to you again, of course, and we'll assess what happens with that visit by President Biden. All the latest for you coming up. Stay with us on the Live Desk.
Who is it? We're here for the show.
More energy
Richie, this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie.
Second best.
You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh!
No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Good afternoon, it is 2 o'clock. This is the live desk here on GB News. Coming up for you this Wednesday lunchtime.
The Prime Minister tells the Commons the UK is working hard to establish exactly what happened at the Gaza Baptist Hospital. As James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, reveals he's travelling back to the Middle East later today. We'll have the latest for you.
Earlier, the US President arrived in Israel and held talks with the Israeli Prime Minister. Joe Biden reiterated his support for Israel and blamed last night's hospital explosion on what he referred to as the other team.
We'll have a GB News exclusive for you as our reporter Charlie Peters in Tel Aviv speaks to a British-Israeli IDF officer who was wounded while fighting Hamas terrorists at a kibbutz in southern Israel.
Let's take you straight to the US President Joe Biden, who is currently speaking.
And she, without looking at me, she turned, she like this, she said, "You look worried, Senator." I said, "I am." She said, "Don't worry, we Jews have a secret weapon in our fight. We have no place else to go." Well, the truth of the matter is, if there weren't an Israel, we'd have to invent one. The truth of the matter is that I believe that, as I went home and said, I got in trouble at the time, but it's true. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And I think the security and safety of Jews worldwide is anchored in the continued vibrance of the State of Israel. That's what I think it's about at its core. And so I've admired you all, this country for so long. And I'm convinced that more people know your responses to what's happening, as opposed to just what war and peace is about. The more they're going to be inclined to embrace Israel. And but there's a lot more to say, but I'd like to talk to you private if I can.
Well, a lot of reaction there to the president meeting first responders and their families there in Tel Aviv, of course, having spoken earlier to Benjamin Netanyahu. But clearly, this is the very personal response from the Prime Minister there as the camera just breaks away. I think he'll be meeting privately with members of those first responders, of course, and finding out how they have been reacting to the various instances across Israel and into Gaza as well. The latest we're getting is that we have seen more explosions on the skyline in Gaza. We've also had protests in the West Bank. It is still very much a fluid situation.
Let's get a full roundup of your latest headlines now with Rhiannon.
Pip, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 3 minutes past 2. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. At least 7 British nationals have been killed and 9 are missing since Hamas's attack on Israel. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister has now confirmed. Well, earlier, the Gaza and Israel crisis dominated PMQs. Both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer struck a similar tone, condemning the actions of Hamas whilst reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself. In this, they stood united. With the casualties in Gaza mounting, both leaders expressed their sympathies with the Palestinian people, in particular following the overnight blast at the Al Ali Arabi hospital, which killed 500 people.
Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House.
Well, US President Joe Biden is, as we speak, meeting and greeting some first responders in Israel and some of the families of those whose loved ones are believed lost or held hostage. And earlier, President Joe Biden met with the Israeli Prime Minister. He's meant to be on a diplomatic mission to prevent an escalation in the region. But after the strike on the Al Ali hospital, a planned meeting with leaders in the Middle East has been cancelled. In a joint press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, President Biden supported the Israeli Defense Forces' claims that the rocket fired was not from Israel and again pledged US support.
Israel, as they respond to these attacks, it seems to me that have to continue to ensure that you have what you need to defend yourselves. And we're going to make sure that occurs, as you know. I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
A Hamas official, meanwhile, has said the US and Western countries supporting Israel hold full responsibility for what he's described as a war against civilians in Gaza. His comments come as another funeral's held to mourn the victims killed during an overnight bombardment in the south of the Gaza Strip. One angry mourner in Khan Yunis also pointed the finger at the US.
President Biden and his administration. Generations will not forget, and history will be recorded, that it was your administration, your billions of dollars, your support with weapons of mass destruction to the Israeli Defense Forces, which has caused what is happening right now in Gaza.
In other news, back here, the rate of inflation remained at 6.7% last month as easing food and drink price rises were offset by higher petrol and diesel prices. The Office for National Statistics says inflation stayed at the same rate despite expectations it would fall again. The reading's important in calculating how much benefit payments will increase next year, as well as some taxes. 10 current and former police officers and staff are being investigated by a police watchdog for their handling of allegations against serial rapist David Carrick. The 48-year-old was jailed for life with a minimum term of 32 years after carrying out what the court heard was a catalogue of violent and brutal sex attacks between 2003 and 2020. A man who abducted a young girl as she walked home in the Scottish borders and then sexually assaulted her has been jailed for 20 years. The High Court in Edinburgh heard Andrew Miller, also known as Amy George, was dressed as a woman when he offered the girl a lift in February this year. The 53-year-old instead drove her to his home, where he sexually abused her for 27 hours. Greta Thunberg is charged with a public order offence after her arrest during a fossil-free London protest. The 20-year-old's accused of breaching a Section 14 order put in place by police outside the Intercontinental Hotel in central London, where oil executives were meeting yesterday. 27 protesters were arrested in total and 26 charged. Greta Thunberg's been released on bail with a trial set for the 15th of next month. A red weather warning for rain has been issued by the Met Office for parts of Scotland. It means very dangerous weather is expected, with extensive flooding likely to pose a risk to life. The weather warning runs from 6 p.m. tomorrow until noon on Friday. And the British Museum has announced plans to digitise its collection following the theft of some items. The museum says the project will take 5 years, with the entire collection accessible online to anyone who wants to explore it. Around 2,000 treasures are thought to have been stolen from the British Museum, with 350 or so recovered so far. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back over to Mark and Pip.
Rhiannon, thanks very much indeed. Let's update you here on the live desk on the latest situation in Israel, where Joe Biden, the US president, has been meeting first responders and their families. Of course, he held the official meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu a little earlier, where he made that assertion in terms of the explosion at the hospital. It was done by the other team, now saying that that comment he made was based on information supplied to him by the Pentagon, not by the Israelis.
And here in the UK, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has told the Commons that the UK will try to independently verify who was behind the blast, with the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly calling for pragmatism and cool heads.
Well, Defence Editor of the Evening Standard, Robert Fox, fighting his cold, has been...
It's GB News cold.
Well, yes. You're with us with the studio, so many thanks for that. We're just learning that James Cleverly, who announced in the Commons that he was visiting the region, perhaps won't be going to Israel, but will be going to Qatar, and also indications that he will go to Egypt and Turkey. Both Qatar and Turkey having indicated they may try and open channels to deal with the hostages. And we had then Rishi Sunak saying that he had been speaking to the Emir of Qatar. Is this going to be top of the list at the moment for the British diplomatic aims?
Yeah,
Britain is quite close to Qatar. You know, they share a squadron. There's a Qatar RAF squadron, and they're very close in training. And there's a lot of criticism, particularly by the Egyptians, of Qatar, because there's a lot of Muslim Brotherhood there, and Muslim Brotherhood is the origins and sponsor, of Hamas.
And Hamas leadership there as well.
The Hamas leadership is there, and it's also in Beirut. I think they're looking for two things. I do agree, absolutely hostages, number one priority. But I think what Britain seems to be getting going is a possible peace and stabilisation force, temporary, to really get in and look after those refugees south of Gaza City, because it really is a dire
where we're seeing more smoke as you speak. This is from Sterot looking into the Gaza Strip across the border there.
One would like to know what Joe Biden actually said to Benjamin Netanyahu. I imagine that he'll be saying, now tell me about this ground operation, which you've been projecting for some time. Can you really do it? And what is your aim? To say, oh, we're going to eradicate Hamas, it's like saying, well, we'll take all the cheese out of the moon. You know, it's a notion. Because, A, we know that Hamas has changed its tactics, very desperate, almost suicide tactics. And even if you can get a lot of Hamas out of northern Gaza, ghastly expression, I know, forgive me for that, I can't think how to put it better. A lot of Hamas remains elsewhere. The political leadership, a lot of the intellectual firepower is, and that is the operative way, and sponsorship comes from the Gulf, places like Qatar and Beirut, and Iran at one remote
as a proxy.
This hospital blast last night, where, of course, it cannot be yet independently verified in terms of exactly what did happen, different versions coming out. Will that make Israel think again about this ground offensive? What impact could it have on their strategy?
I doubt very much, because it depends, and we don't know in the councils of Benjamin Netanyahu who has the upper hand. If you have people like Benny Gantz and a predecessor of Benny Gantz on that side of thing, in two respects, Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister, and like Gantz, a former Chief of Staff, about which they know. Netanyahu has a bit of a military background, but it's quite a small military background.
He was with this hostage rescue squad, wasn't he?
And very strange reports coming out. He is being persuaded by his hard anti-Arab right, the religious right, and it depends whether he goes forward. I think that what the IDF must be saying, can we really do it? It's a very, very sophisticated and difficult job. But I'd like to talk about the BDA, battle damage analysis. It is very, very difficult. We've been here before. Sarajevo, you know, was it a false flag by the Bosniak Muslim forces, or was it by the Serbs? It's very difficult to pin down unless you have substantial remains of the projectile. You've got to have something written on it or an explosive signature about it. That's point one. And you would have to have very close examination of the crater, and it may be too late already for both.
Well, let's put those issues to the spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, Tal Henrik, who can now join us. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I don't know if you were able to hear what Robert was talking about there. Clearly, number one, it is important for you and others to establish exactly what's happened at this hospital, but it does seem the diplomatic fallout has already happened in that President Biden cannot hold these four-way talks now.
Well, that is true. We are very grateful for President Biden for arriving here in the middle of a war. His arrival to Israel right now speaks volumes of the American and international support that we have been receiving, of the standing by Israel. And as Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said, Israel's right to defend itself, full stop. And it's very important. It was also very significant that President Biden, in his own voice, told the world that he believes that Israel was not behind the terrible tragedy that took place yesterday in Gaza when that missile hit the Al Ahli hospital. We have abundance of evidence, including video footage, including a phone call between Hamas terrorist militants that was intercepted, that proves that this is on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They sent out, they were firing a barrage of rockets towards Israeli territory. One of them fell short within the territory of the Gaza Strip and hit the parking lot of that hospital, causing a tragedy. Now, the numbers are unverified. Nobody knows, and nobody can take Hamas's numbers or anything that they say without a huge grain of salt.
Yeah, the Gaza health authorities have asserted 477 people have been killed. But clearly, looking at the pictures, there has been substantial damage, however that occurred. What is your assessment within the government now about the ramifications for this? Does it make it even more difficult to move forward diplomatically?
We have zero responsibility for whatever happens in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is under Hamas's control. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is 100% funded by Iran, by the way, Hamas is 93%, is also over there. And they are acting against Israel, but not only against Israel, also against their own civilians. You see, Israel, we try to minimize, we seek to minimize civilian casualty. But Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they want to do exactly the opposite. Their goal is to maximize civilian casualties. And when I'm saying it, I mean civilian casualties on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. The higher the number they put out, well, the greater their success.
You say you have zero responsibility there, but do you not have any responsibility when it comes to this deepening humanitarian crisis and staying within international law?
Well, first, international law does not apply to the terrorists that we're dealing with, the terrorists that brought on us the terrible massacre of October 7th, in which they butchered 1,400 of our people, maimed and injured 4,000, and abducted into the Gaza Strip nearly 200 Israeli civilians. Some of them are dual nationality citizenship holders. So to your question, we want humanitarian aid to reach the right people in the Gaza Strip. We don't want Palestinian civilians to get in the crossfire. We don't want them to suffer because of what Hamas is doing. We want the humanitarian aid to reach the right people. But what we cannot do is that let humanitarian aid in and then to have it repurposed to be part of the Hamas war machine. And just to give you one example, just a few days ago, the UN agency UNRWA admitted that in Gaza City, Hamas militants removed and stole some of their stockpiles of fuels and supplies and medical supplies. This could have been used by the population. It could have been used to, medical purposes in hospitals, but they are taking this equipment. So that is one thing. And also regarding to the humanitarian aid, in the bigger picture, this also has to be somewhat contingent upon the fate of our people who are still being held captive there.
Tal, can I ask you about that? Because we've heard from the Prime Minister here and our Foreign Secretary that certainly Rishi Sunak's been in touch with the Emir of Qatar. James Cleverly is going to be travelling to Qatar, also to Egypt and also to Turkey. Are you getting indications, and I know you can't speak about the operational details, but that the hostages at the moment are at the top of the list of these efforts to try and move things on?
That is 100% one of our top priorities in this military operation taking place in Gaza right now. First, we want to make sure that Israeli civilians and Israeli territory is secured at all time on all of our borders, all of our fronts are under Israeli control. We don't take it as a given after what transpired on October 7th, but also we want to make sure that we will dismantle Hamas's military capabilities and also make sure that by the end of this, they will lack the motivation to ever hurt us as they did. They will not have the capability to do so. And of course, releasing the hostages. We want to see our sons and daughters back home. We know that there are different diplomatic efforts, which I cannot expand on, international ones underway. But here's what I can tell you, that just a few days ago, there was an attempt to release foreign nationals that are being held in Gaza through the Rafah border crossing, which is a border between Gaza and Egypt. But then Hamas blocked their way. They blocked the way. They didn't let them out of foreign nationals. So Hamas is the one committing war crimes here.
Are you able to amplify on that in any way? How was that organised, and who did that involve?
No, I can't. Unfortunately, I cannot expand. I cannot expand.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, bearing in mind the diplomatic track, and to pick up on what Robert Fox was saying, we've not seen any ground offensive. Is it the case that there are voices now within Israel urging the IDF to think again about what could be the cost of going into this maze of streets and tunnels and rubble?
Well, there are all kinds of voices if you listen to Israeli media, the Israeli public, but I cannot expand on what I know, and generally I cannot speak of military operation ahead of time. I'm not going to divulge any kind of military strategy that we have, but there are plans that are being discussed, and all I can say is that Israel will do what it takes in order to dismantle Hamas. By the end of this, Hamas will be no longer. We cannot allow to continue to live side by side by this monstrous terrorist organization. We will never forget what they did to us, and we are going to hit them very hard.
Tal Henrik, spokesman for Benjamin Netanyahu, thank you very much indeed for joining us there live in Israel. Thank you.
Do stay with us here on the live desk. We will be bringing you the latest, and we'll be joined by a reporter in Israel as the Israeli military prepares for the next phase of its campaign against Hamas. Stay with us.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer, and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Akweer, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday, where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle.
Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's
my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, All you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Welcome back to the live desk. Let's take you to the live shot there from Gaza City. At the moment, no smoke being seen, but we have seen rocket fire earlier today and plumes of black smoke indications, explosions. So there is still much aerial warfare, if we can put it that way, amidst the diplomatic efforts as President Biden speaks to Benjamin Netanyahu and tries to move the whole situation forward.
Let's cross now to GB News reporter Charlie Peters, who is in Tel Aviv. Charlie, we keep talking about the US president trying to move things forward, but he's got big problems now, hasn't he, with that summit being hosted by Jordan that Egyptian and Palestinian leaders were due to attend. That's been cancelled. So what can President Biden actually do now in terms of diplomacy?
The most significant effect I think that the US side can have here now is achieving more humanitarian support in the Gaza Strip. We know that that was a key mission for US Secretary of State Antony Blinken last week, to try and urgently get support for the internally displaced people in the Gaza Strip. Of course, last week they were ordered by the IDF to flee from the north to the south, some 1.1 million people there. And the reports from the south of the Strip have been, well, they've been extraordinary. Just suffering has been relentless. The lack of water, the lack of electricity, the lack of food, and dozens of trucks waiting on the side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, preparing to go in, but so far blocked. They have announced, the IDF, in the last 7 hours or so, that there will be a humanitarian safe zone on the coast in Al-Muwasi, some kilometres west of the Yunus Khan, the city in the south where many people have moved to after that forced evacuation of Gaza City. But the IDF, 7 hours on, still have not confirmed to us how they intend to secure that humanitarian safe zone. They won't tell us how they will supply it with aid. They won't even say how people will be able to get there. We know last week that there were so-called humanitarian safe corridors for people to move from the north to the south, but so far no information on how people will be able to reach that zone on the coast. It could be an opportunity for Israel to supply aid from the sea. That might be why that location has been selected after President Biden arrives. We know that Israel maintains a sea, air and land blockade, so it has total control of access to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. But what does Biden do next? I mean, the call from the Arab states this morning is very much one of enough is enough. There must be a ceasefire. We must cease the preparation for a ground invasion from the Israeli side, and Biden will be sat between those two sides trying to understand what the Israeli mission is next after last night's incident in North Gaza.
And in terms of the diplomatic dance, Charlie, we had Rishi Sunak, of course, in Prime Minister's questions in Westminster, saying that he's spoken to the Emir of Qatar and using contacts in the region. We now know that James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, is on his way, but not to Israel, again to Qatar and to Egypt and Turkey, which in itself is interesting. I mean, are these back channels they're trying to establish to get the hostages sorted out?
Well, the US and the UK have significant connections, obviously, in Jordan, and they use that route to make connections into Israel and also to regional partners here, particularly in the Arab world. But this significant interception via Qatar will seem to many as an opportunity to try and establish more information about those hostages, but also, I think, crucially, some sort of reassurance about the situation with Iran. I think a lot of those Arab nations, and particularly Saudi Arabia and those in Jordan, are concerned about the rise of Iranian proxies in the last 24 hours, in particular after the incident in North Gaza last night. We have seen reports of Iranian drones, yes, intercepted by American forces over Iraq, the first time in over a year that there has been some targeting efforts by drones in that country on American forces. And in the last hour, there were reports of a resumption of hostilities in southern Lebanon, gunfire heard over the border there, and the IDF responding with artillery. This comes in the background of course, the Iranian foreign minister, repeatedly warning that they are ready to take preemptive action should that convoy on the south in Israel look to move into invading the Gaza Strip. So that meeting in Qatar, a diplomatic effort not only for the hostages, but I think to reassure regional partners who are very nervous that any further Israeli action could inspire the Shia Crescent from Tehran to Lebanon to rise with extended munitions and more escalating forces in Israel, fighting on several fronts.
And also, Charlie, we are starting to see these protests now popping up more and more all over the Arab world. The real fear that this outrage could just explode.
That's right, and this fear is stemming from what many people here are now saying was a misreported situation last night. Obviously, the IDF has released their claim on what they thought happened last night. They claim that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired a rocket which then came back down onto the hospital, the Christian Baptist hospital there. Hamas and the PIJ reject those reports, but the Israelis have released more evidence. It's compelling, it's not conclusive, and it does appear that the Pentagon does support the analysis released by the IDF. There's also some questions over the death toll release. The Hamas-run health ministry yesterday said that some 500 dead had been announced, but there's no confirmation about the death toll after that explosion in the north. And as daylight has come across this area, more information is coming out about the situation on the ground and what people have been protesting against all over the Arab world at Israeli, American and British embassies does not appear to be as severe as was originally reported. It is a tragedy, but it is not the grave devastation by an airstrike, as many are claiming. That seems to be disputed very heavily by the Israeli and American sides today. But it is a serious risk. And the Arab nations that condemned Israel last night with this new information have not said further on that attack. I think, in many eyes, they are happy for the mood to be in the Arab world that Israel did this, because it creates a pressure for Israel to not continue its military action, because they know that things could flare up very aggressively in their embassies for their nationals and for US interests abroad, particularly in the Arab regions.
Charlie, in Tel Aviv, thank you for that. With Rishi Sunak, of course, saying British intelligence working rapidly to independently establish who's behind the blast. More from Tel Aviv, more from Robert Fox, defence editor with the Evening Standard, here in the studio shortly. But first, latest headlines with Rhiannon.
Mark, thank you. It's 2:33. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. At least 7 British nationals have been killed and 9 are missing since Hamas's attack on Israel, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister has now confirmed. Well, earlier, the Gaza and Israel crisis dominated PMQs. Both Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer struck a similar tone, condemning the actions of Hamas whilst reaffirming Israel's right to defend itself. In this, they stood united. With the casualties in Gaza mounting, both leaders expressed their sympathies with the Palestinian people following the overnight blast at the Al Ali Arabi hospital, which killed nearly 500 people. US President Joe Biden has met with the Israeli Prime Minister. He's meant to be on a diplomatic mission to prevent an escalation in the region. But after last night's strike on the hospital, a planned meeting with leaders in the Middle East has been cancelled. In a joint press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu, President Biden supported the Israeli Defense Forces' claims that the rocket fired was not from Israel and again pledged US support for Israel. In other news, the rate of inflation remained at 6.7% last month here in the UK as easing food and drink price rises were offset by higher petrol and diesel prices. The Office for National Statistics says inflation stayed at the same rate despite expectations it would fall again. The reading's important in calculating how much benefit payments will increase next year, as well as some taxes. And a red weather warning for rain has been issued by the Met Office for parts of Scotland. It means dangerous weather conditions are expected, with extensive flooding posing a risk to life. The weather warning runs from 6 o'clock tomorrow evening until noon on Friday. And you can get more on all of those stories by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
We're here for the show.
More energy this time!
Welcome to the Dinosaur Hour. I was married to a therapist.
And you survived?
I thought we were getting Hugh Laurie. Second best. You interviewed Saddam Hussein. What's that like?
I was terrified. I'm playing strip poker with these three.
Oh! No, thank you.
My CDs need to be put in alphabetical order.
Are you going to be problematic again?
The Dinosaur Hour. Sunday, the 29th of October at 9 on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back to the live desk on GB News. We're continuing to talk to Defence Editor of the Evening Standard, Robert Fox, still with us in the studio to talk about all this. Well, I mean, it's just... there's so much to this, it's hard to know where to start. But what I do want to ask you, Robert, is what we've just heard in the last few moments, that the United Nations Security Council is now voting on a resolution that is causing for a humanitarian pause in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. How much power could that vote have? How much influence?
Not much, but it is a big signal. I would imagine that Russia and China, as permanent members, will sit on their hands or cause trouble. The problem with Security Council resolutions is we had through so many crises like this that they could volunteer things like safe zones in Bosnia, for example, and the members who have the capacity to do it very often will not do something. And I think that this is really the most interesting thing about the Biden visit, related to the Security Council, the dog that refuses to bark. It isn't the dog that didn't bark, that he wanted to engage with the Arab nations. Really, Mr. Abbas, King Abdullah, President Sisi, you were saying, I'm going to sit on my hands because I don't like the way the Americans are behaving towards us and towards Israel. Let 1.5 million die in destitution in Gaza. It's an appalling thing. They have shown no statesmanship whatsoever in this regard, because the main issue, as you rightly said, is humanitarian, on 2 counts, hostages, and bringing succour, that means help of all kinds, to those desperate people in mid and southern
But
Gaza Strip
one
now.
reflects maybe that for King Abdullah, of course, he is looking at his own domestic position and what happens to the Jordanian people if he's seen to be welcoming Biden after that hospital attack. I mean, he's made a political calculation, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. And of course, he is well aware that there's a predominantly Palestinian population in Jordan. I think his wife is Palestinian.
Yes.
And he has to play to that. They are in perhaps the most difficult position, but one would believe that they also, peculiarly, because of their historic interest in places like Jerusalem, which runs right up to today, Guardian of the Holy Sites and so on, that they could perhaps exert subtly more leverage than any of the others. They need to exert leadership with the other Palestinian leaders, namely Abbas, Fatah, and the Palestinian Authority on the West
And we've
Bank.
seen the increasingly difficult position on the West Bank, of course, which is underlining the importance of that accord.
Yes, but the trouble is that it looks as if that regime is in real trouble. 87-year-old president. The trouble is, with whatever you say about the Arab representation in the West Bank and Gaza, is they haven't been too hot on democracy of late. And that is a big problem.
Is there a new generation that is waiting in the wings, or is this still the old men?
In Jenin and places like that, people who turn to violence. But where they should be worried, and you've still got it in Gaza, you've still got it throughout the West Bank, is the educated middle class, or people who want to get on with education, who really need help. The Israelis, I have to say, frankly, haven't been helpful at all about that, particularly on the West Bank. But institutions like the British Council, funny enough, have done a lot of work. That's where the hope lies. The problem is that it is a conversation between old men, as you rightly said. Netanyahu has been around for a long time.
And carrying the baggage of the previous conflicts.
Absolutely. And I think that that's the thing that they have really got to unlock. You were asking me, Pip was asking me before as we came on air, how do I see it end? And I never, journalists are very poor prophets, I would say that, me included, very much so. But I don't see this being ended by force of arms.
OK. Oh, well, will it end at all? Is this just one of those things that will just carry on?
I think the generation game, I think it's when things change in places like Iran. And they will do, because the generation game is playing big there.
Yeah, and Hezbollah, indeed. Well, of course, the war with Hamas, as it is at the moment, has meant hundreds of thousands have been turning up to sign up on the front line. Of course, they are in the firing line directly. Our reporter Charlie Peters has spoken to a British-Israeli IDF officer who was injured while fighting the Hamas terrorists at a kibbutz in southern Israel. His identity being kept secret for security reasons.
At 7 a.m., they woke us up, told us that Israel is in a total war, and we need to get ready and that we are going down to the Gaza Strip.
Had you heard any reports about the extent of the Hamas violence in that kibbutz?
We didn't have reports. On our way, we opened phones to understand what's happening, because the IDF couldn't understand what's happening because there was too much information going from everywhere. We saw the live streams of Hamas, and then we understand that something really strange is happening.
And when you got to the kibbutz building, that's when you engaged with the Hamas fighters there?
Yeah, before we saw a lot of stuff that Hamas terrorists did, a lot of bodies of innocent citizens. And when we came to kibbutz Be'eri, it was a junction of Be'eri by the gate of the kibbutz. So we heard already all of the shooting, and we understand that the massacre is still happening. I have to say that the people of Be'eri fought very bravely. A lot of time that we saw also bodies of Israeli innocent citizens in the houses, but also bodies of terrorists that we didn't kill. The people of Be'eri managed to kill some of them.
What was the fighting like? Very close combat, very close quarters?
Yeah, very close combats. Most of our combats are 5 to 7 meters from each other, or that they were inside the houses, and we try to break inside the houses. In every house, there were between 3 or 4 terrorists that stayed inside the houses. I saw 3 terrorists. I yelled to them, IDF, IDF, because we didn't understand if they were terrorists or citizens people that have weapons.
When did you suffer your injury? What happened?
I suffered it on Sunday evening. We did our last...
last fight?
The last fight with terrorists, bad luck. A machine gun started to shoot on us from inside the house.
A machine gun shot at you from inside where you were? So you ran into a house and there was a terrorist inside there?
4 terrorists.
4?
We tried to shoot on the terrorists, they shot us back. My soldier that operates the machine gun fell down and dead in the place. I got injured in my stomach and in my hand. So I was out on my back because I was bleeding from the butt, from the
bullet in your stomach. Yeah.
Exactly, that I was not going to bleed. And I started shooting on the terrorist. I shot 90, 100 bullets on them. One of my soldiers threw a grenade, he couldn't put it inside the hallway, so it came to the living room where I was. It explodes. I have no idea why. As a religious man, I'm saying it's because God, but I didn't get injured from the grenade. So another officer of my unit managed to break inside the house from the kitchen window. He took me outside, then the tank came and finished the job.
Destroyed the house. The tank destroyed the house after you all pulled out.
On the terrorist. And we could gladly say that the kibbutz Be'eri has 0 terrorists inside of them. I have to say that I was really impressed from the brave of the citizens of Be'eri.
Right now, Israel is preparing for that likely invasion of the Gaza Strip. Do you think the country and the army is ready for the next phase of this war?
Of course.
You're ready to go again?
I will go again next week after I will heal.
Charlie Peters reporting there from Israel. Well, we can cross to Freddie Gray, who's deputy editor of The Spectator and host of the Americano podcast. Good afternoon to you, Freddie. This is a real tinderbox situation now that President Biden has flown into. What exactly do you think he can achieve, if anything now, diplomatically, when you look at where we're at?
Well, there are a lot of cynics on Capitol Hill in Washington who'd say if you have a tinderbox situation, the last thing you want to do is throw in Joe Biden. And I mean, well, you know, he's already expressed warm words of support towards Israel. He hugged Netanyahu, which is quite a big statement. I think there is some concern that his Middle Eastern policy is quite incoherent, and that is not helping an already very dangerous situation. We've seen already that his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was snubbed by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and given quite a stern talking to by the Egyptian leadership. One of the reasons why that is because Biden, when he was a candidate, started calling Saudi Arabia a pariah state because of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Washington Post contributor, among other things. And having done that, when he then reached the White House, he quickly realized that he couldn't really afford to alienate Saudi Arabia. And the White House performed a spectacular reverse ferret and started sucking up to Mohammed bin Salman again. The trouble is he seems to have remembered that, and he doesn't seem to trust the Biden administration. And to resolve this conflict, Israel and America are going to have to try and work with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. Whether they can do that at the moment, given the mood of the Islamic world towards Israel, is a very, very grave and important question. I don't quite know the answer.
OK, let's put another analysis forward, and that is that Biden actually is a foreign affairs veteran. He met many of these people when he was vice president. He knows the ropes, and that perhaps that signal of the greeting from Netanyahu was a direct signal to Iran.
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, Biden certainly rates himself. He prides himself on being a great operator, on being able to talk tough to people, yet also showing compassion and so on. There are people around him who support that, but I think you'd also have to look at his record. I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan may have been the right decision, but it was disastrously handled.
Yeah.
He got Iraq wrong. He's got other wars wrong. He got Libya wrong. He's not had a particularly good track record, but he has done a lot of it. I'll give you that. He has got a lot of experience.
The overwhelming demand now is to get this humanitarian aid in, to get this Rafah crossing open. Is Egypt going to shift on this, do you think? Can Biden exert any influence there?
I mean, America is still the preeminent world power, and it has enormous military and financial strength. So, of course, it can exert pressure on Egypt. The timing with the hospital bombing last night was terrible in terms of his visit, because it meant that this meeting between Biden and Egypt's leader, as well as the Palestinian president and the Jordanian king, was cancelled. That was really unfortunate timing, whoever's to blame for it. But I don't know whether that means that America can't pressure Israel or Arab states on the aid, or even pressure Israel to help facilitate it. America obviously has lots of leverage, and Biden will be able to use that.
Yeah, well, we'll see, of course, with him still actually in Israel. It's significant itself, maybe with another news conference shortly. But thanks for your thoughts. Let's just turn back to Robert, who's still with us in the studio, defence editor at the London Evening Standard. Why has Hezbollah not moved? Why is it still quiet on that border with Lebanon? Are they waiting?
Keeping its powder dry. I know that they've got an experience where they had an all-out war, 2006, where they showed great skill, and that they had upped their game in terms of the use of drones and land missiles and sea missiles. They hit an Israeli naval ship. But they don't want to go in for that again unless they can win. A lot of Israel, most of Israel, is within range, technically, of Hezbollah rockets, but it's the same problem for Hamas. You say you want to rub out Israel, what are you going to do with all the people in that land? And the fact is that Hezbollah also, I would like to nuance a bit of what Freddie Gray was saying. That was too much, and I am too much, from a Western perspective.
We've got to think differently about it.
You see, Hezbollah is Shia, it's Lebanese, it's sponsored by Iran, but they don't like Iran very much because one is Arab and the other is Persian, Farsi. And these sort of things really count. And Hezbollah would want to make a throw that guarantees them success and doesn't undermine their position in Lebanon, where they're in government.
And therefore,
this is the way it works.
Is the Hezbollah mindset very difficult to that of Hamas, even though they're both being supported by proxy by Iran?
They have, my enemy's enemy, kind of, and that's why they're helping with munitions and training and so on, but they are not ideologically totally aligned. And that is also the problem, to gloss a bit of what Freddie was saying. No, you can't expect Saudi Arabia to get in. They never do in these conflicts in the past. They stand back, watch what's happened, and then take advantage of it. But the common factor to both Egypt and Saudi reluctance is the Muslim Brotherhood. They are very, very aware. That's why Khashoggi, that's why Sisi came to power after Mwazi. Muslim Brotherhood tried to impose an Islamic regime, and they said, we're having enough, and that's why they're suspicious of Qatar. And you see all these cutouts, it's spaghetti. It means everybody is finding an excuse not to take prime responsibility.
And this is what Biden's trying to untangle at the moment.
And it's the thing that Biden is trying to untangle, as you say. But the other thing, which Freddie suggested, quite rightly, is they do give an awful lot of money to Egypt and Israel.
Mentioning Biden, we are expecting a press conference that he's due to give very shortly. I just wanted to ask you, when we earlier spoke to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's spokesperson, she said that there was a rescue attempt to get 4 of the hostages out. It was launched near the Rafah crossing, but Hamas blocked their way. That's something that we haven't heard before, is it? Which suggests there is intelligence to know where these hostages are in Gaza.
Oh, there's quite a bit of intelligence on that. They're doing it with SIGINT. They're doing, I think that, quite rightly, Mr. Cleverly and Mr. Sunak know a lot more than they could possibly say at the moment. That's why they ordered in those 2 Royal Navy ships. They're not gunboats. They're actually, one is a big hospital ship, and squads of Royal Marines who are very good at rescue, and the helicopters are configured for that. What one would like to know, and as I said, but historically Britain has got such an interest, and a lot of the educational structure is British still, whatever they like to say. But one would like to know where the European allies really are. Scholz has said a bit of this and a bit of that. Macron is important, but he's got so much on his plate from the Mediterranean anyway, from North Africa and further south. But there really has to be solidarity. The United Nations, to go back to your point, your earlier point, yes, that they will talk. But the real question with the United Nations, there are two things, is whether they can deliver. Organisations like UNRWA and UNICEF have been brilliant, but the politics, awful.
Yeah, and it continues, that dance. Robert, thank you for your analysis. As we say, we're expecting a President Biden news conference. We'll have all the latest for you here on GB News. Stay with us.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to ordinary people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
There's only three people you can trust in life: your doctor, your lawyer,